to the summer semester. This course is an unusual one. We're going to be looking at halachic principles that are just beneath the surface of some of the great stories in the Chumash. Perhaps even, I guess we'll broaden that to look at stories in the Tanakh in a larger sense. And we're going to cover a lot of ground. That course description is broad enough to cover a lot of different dimensions. We're going to try to do justice to a whole bunch of them. So happy that you have decided to join us either in person or via the recording. Just hang in there. It's going to be an exciting ride. All right, in order to appreciate what we're going to be doing, be able to have this ability to look at the Tanakh in a new kind of way. This is not something that most people have. They don't understand what I'm going to be teaching you. I think people err a lot in this particular area. I'm going to mention as the course goes on some of the kind of sad or outrageous mistakes I've seen people make in their understanding of reading the Tanakh, of understanding the way Chazal and the later Mefarshim, how they speak. And if you have the clarity that this course gives, I think that it will position you, Mir Hashem, very well to for a long, productive lifetime, a career of Torah study, of deep, profound Torah study. This course also, I can't stress enough, I can't emphasize enough the importance of attending every course that Live Knows College for Women offers, and then going and watching all of the past recordings, because they all interconnect. The courses aren't designed, they aren't just like haphazard, like, oh, here's a course, here's a topic. And I'm going to point that out as we go along, and you'll see how everything interconnects. And if you have the various building blocks, the fundamental skills in a whole bunch of areas, if you have precision and deep analytical skills in a whole bunch of areas, so when you put them all together, this is a course where a lot of those different kind of skills all come together. And I'm going to never miss an opportunity to point out to you exactly what I mean when I say that. You'll see where the other Live Knows courses, and I'll make reference to them, not just the courses that I've taught, although those are fabulous, but also some of the other instructors, all the other instructors, you'll see that they all connect. Okay, so in order to appreciate where we're going to go, we have to start at the very, very fundamentals, the most fundamental ideas. These are foundational ideas. And the greatest of all of them is the fact that the mitzvot are not arbitrary legislation. The mitzvot are not mere laws with a small L, in the way that we talk about laws that are enacted by human beings. Like when we talk about laws made in Washington regarding taxation or immigration, things like that, lahavdil. Those are laws with a little L. We're not talking about that. When we talk about the mitzvot, those are laws, not with a little L. They're laws with a capital L. They're laws of nature, laws with a capital L. They're encoded into the very structure of reality by the Creator. The mitzvot reflect, this is an very important idea. This is the most foundational idea that we're going to have in the course, and everything's going to be built upon this. The mitzvot reflect the structure of objective reality. They reveal the very fabric of creation. So when Chazal tell us, for example, that the Avot and the Imahot observed the mitzvot long before they were formally given at Har Sinai to the Am Yisrael, right? That kind of a statement could be dismissed as fairy tale kinds of ideas, or they're cute. But what does that mean? What does it mean? So to say that the Avot and the Imahot observed the mitzvot long before they were given formally to the Bnei Yisrael at Har Sinai, what it means is that they were sensitive and they were keyed in to the very texture of existence. They had reached a level, they had refined themselves. And this was, of course, on the basis, on the strength of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu had reached this level, and he taught his greatest disciple, Sarah Imenu. He was a worthy disciple and became his partner And the two of them are giants like nothing we can ever talk about. We can't imagine them. There's no way that we can relate, we can imagine such a thing, that they had reached a level, they had refined themselves, they had elevated themselves. Now here, we see very clearly, here's where the Slabodka approach to learning Tanakh comes in. It's a very obvious one, because if we think of these people like us, if we think that just, the only reason HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke to them is because they came before us. So then we can't learn. We might as well close all the books. It would be better if we didn't learn at all. But if we learn properly, if we relate to these people, if we shrink back in awe, as we realize who these people, now we can never realize who they were. Just for us to know, though, like what we are to the amoeba spiritually, that's what they were to us. And it's not meant for us to despair and to throw in, we won't be able to get there. It's for us to recognize that we have that strength. It's been bequeathed to us. We've been inherited it from them. But in order like this, if we read these stories in Tanakh, and we read them as a bunch of stories of people, a bunch of people acting the way we would. So, and the stories lend themselves, they're written in a way that if we choose to err, by the way, that's how non-Jews read the Tanakh. They have no Masorah the way we do. They don't understand any Slabodka approach to learning Tanakh properly. So they read stories. This one's an adulterer. This one's violent. They had a marital feud. Their people were stealing. They were rotten. They were selfish. If you do that, if that's the guiding star is that low, so then the bar is that low. So if you woke up and you didn't kill anybody today, you're a big tzaddik or a big tzaddikist. That's not how we understand the stories of Tanakh. We understand who these people were. We understand because we have Masorah. We recognize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke to them, that they raised themselves to levels that would seem to us to be more than a human being could ever possibly aspire to become. But that's not true. We dare not say that. Every human being has the ability to rise to these levels. Chazal tells us we're supposed to ask ourselves all the time, to challenge ourselves, right? When will I reach the point where I'm similar, where I can even touch, for example, I can touch the heels of the Avos, the Nimahot. So, but we can get there. We could get there. But we have to begin with humility and honesty to recognize who these people were. So the Gemara in Yuma tells us, it's Yuma 28a. If you take notes, I'm going to send out handouts, but I'm going to also mention some things that just don't happen to come up. But take good notes, and then you can look later on, and you can edit. I'm not going to do justice to this topic. I'm honest enough to tell you that I'm not going to do justice. But if you have the ideas, these are sacred and profound ideas. I'm really neither of those. But if you can take these ideas, you can deepen them, refine them, elevate them. These are spectacular, breathtaking ideas. So the Avot and the Imahot observed the mitzvot long before the Torah was given, because they had reached a point where they were sensitive to, and they were keyed into the very nature, the texture of reality. Now, if we think about that, let that settle for a moment, right? In other words, we can sense certain laws with a capital L of the spiritual world, right? In other words, if I have an apple, let's say I'm sitting under a tree, an apple tree, and I see an apple fall. So I might tumble to the idea of the law with a capital L of gravity. Right? I can sense those kinds of laws. I can perceive them in my day-to-day existence. I can see, for example, phenomena, laws of nature like friction. There are other kinds of things, magnetism. I'm sensitive, I'm perceptive enough that I can see those kinds of things, as can you. The Avot and the Imahot were at a level, they had refined themselves such that they were perceptive in the spiritual realm as well. And they could sense, they could perceive, they could experience the laws of spiritual reality. It's a very, very important idea. Now, one immediate realization, one consequence of that is that the mitzvot, the Torah is filled with mitzvot. There are 613. They break up into hundreds of billions of little mitzvot and details. So all of those, the mitzvot, clearly, if what we're saying is true, and it is, the mitzvot predate and they exist independently of any historical reasons or rationales that might be given for them. In this context, I would like you to look you received a handout. So if you open up the handout package, so the first thing I want to look at is I want to show you something from the Beis HaLevi. So the Beis HaLevi, you have two versions of it. You have it in the Hebrew original. You also have an excerpt. You also have an excerpt of a translation that was done by Livnos senior tenured instructor, Rabbi Yisrael Herzog, who was a Gadol, and he's just started his third course for Livnos. You can jump on and you'll be happy if you do. I guarantee it. So the Beis HaLevi is talking about, we'll look in the Hebrew for a moment, the Beis HaLevi is talking about the fact that he describes this situation. The Torah tells us, and we know this very well, we're familiar with this from the Haggadah, that there are four archetypes of children. So one of them, the Rasha, the one that the Chazal describe as the Rasha. If we had time, it's beyond the scope of this to describe why this person is a Rasha, this child, why Chazal label the person that way, for another time, perhaps. But the Rasha's approach when he dismisses what we're doing. And the Beis HaLevi, in other words, different Mefarshim explain different interpretations of what the Rasha is saying. When he says, what is this avoda to you? Ma avoda ha'avoda azot lachem. Like, why do you do it? Why do you do it? Specifically the Korban Pesach. Why this avoda? So the Beis HaLevi explains that what he's asking is this. It's an honest question. And he says, the Korban Pesach, we eat the Korban Pesach because there was a time in history in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, the Jews had to take the idol that the Egyptian, the animal the Egyptians worshipped as an idol, and the Jewish people had to slaughter their idol before their eyes and offer it as a korban, consume it, do all kinds of things that were quite infuriating to the Mitzrayim. And in that way show our complete rejection of any idolatrous notions, any of the notions to which we had been exposed in Mitzrayim. We rejected them all. And as a result of that, we were worthy to be taken out of Mitzrayim. So the Rasha says, okay, I get that. It makes perfect sense. It did back then. And maybe at times in history when there was rampant idolatry. But according to this reading, right, the Beis HaLevi understands what the Rasha is asking. The Rasha says, but nowadays, where, certainly at least where we live, monotheism seems to be the rule rather than the exception. Although I must tell you parenthetically, I have to question that assumption that the Beis HaLevi makes, because all I see is idolatry everywhere in every other religion on the face of this planet, other than Yadus. But if we assume for the moment that, right, this is how the Rasha is looking, he says, today we live in a country, in a world, let's say at least in the Western world, which is dominated by what, well, I guess some halachic authorities, B'diavad perhaps, might consider to be also monotheistic, a little bit of a stretch, but going different parameters for them. But he says, if we're surrounded, everyone are monotheists, why do we need this mitzvah of eating the Korban Pesach? Why do we need the mitzvah? It doesn't make any sense anymore. I understand the historical reason for it. And when it made sense, when it was necessary, fantastic. But nowadays, it doesn't make any sense. We've moved past that. So if you look in the part that I've said, I think it begins with Al Dvar of Elu Ba Tshuva. So here comes the answer. So he says, I've underlined some of the things. I have a system of notation of underlining when I give classes or when I learn with other people. I didn't do this underlining for this course. So the notation, the convention is a little different. I apologize, but we'll try to get through it. But he says, Yesh b'devarim elu teshuvo stira gedola chol divrei hapikursut shalo. In the answer that we give, the answer that the parent gives to the child, he says there's a profound, a very important response to the heresy that the child is expressing. He says, who like this? Here's the answer. The afagav the tamzeh emet. Even though the explanation given for the Korban Pesach, it's true. The Pesach shasu yisrael b'Mitzrayim b'shat ma'isa hayta hora lebitul avodah zar shelahem. It was a profound, decisive rejection of avodah zarah. Mikol makom od chidesh larasha chidesh devarim shelo yada mehem. The parent, in responding, in saying, Bavur zeh asa Hashem that Satan in Mitzrayim, that's the pasuk, that's the response. He says there's a huge insight in that. There's an important idea being shared. And he says this, I'm going to go down a little bit. Here it is. Even mitzvot, when we know the reason, right? Skip down a little bit. That's not the real reason. It's not the main reason. That's not the reason why the mitzvah exists. Vatam, the reason that we're given, mutal aleinu hachov l'kaim. We're told this particular reason, it allows us to pick up a dimension of gratitude. HaKadosh Baruch Hu protected us during that tumultuous event. It was a very dangerous moment in history, and we have a chance to fulfill the mitzvah. However, he says, "Aval ikar yesoda shel hamitzvah lama kach hi hamitzvah enenu b'shvil zeh ma shehayav Mitzrayim." The real reason, the existence of the mitzvah, is not because of what happened in Mitzrayim. You know why? He says, "Torah kadma la'olam." The Torah existed 940 generations, I think Chazal tell us, before the creation of the universe. There was no Mitzrayim, there was nothing. And yet the mitzvah existed. The mitzvah existed. He says, I'm going to skip down a little bit. Right? There, all these mitzvot that we associate with Pesach, they were all there. They were all there before any of these historical events took place. I'm skipping a little bit. You got to admit, al karcha, against your will, you'd be forced to admit, to acknowledge that these mitzvot do not spring out of, they didn't flow out of the geula, rak hula hefech. And here's the punchline: the mizchut mitzvah mitzvot, the Pesach matzah marer sheyesh balayla hazot nitzmacha geula tami mitzrayim balayla zeh. What he says is that it's just the opposite. It's not that we have these mitzvot, we observe them because of what happened. Oh, that's not the case at all. It's just the contrary. It's the opposite. It is because we observe those mitzvot, we were redeemed. We were redeemed. And the pasuk says, Ba'avur zeh, as the Agada tells us, we're able to point to these mitzvot in front of us, these props, these mitzvah props, Pesach, Matzah, Maror, all those props at the Seder, because we observed those mitzvot, Asa Hashem li b'tzeit mitzrayim, Hashem did for me and took me out, which means, right, the causality is flipped, because the mitzvot are facts of nature. They're phenomena of nature. What that means is that keyed into the beginning of time, the beginning of creation, the Jewish people, there was an energy that was being released. There was a cosmic energy of liberation that was being introduced into all of creation, into all of existence. And it was keyed in, it was introduced on the 15th day of the month of Nisan. That always existed. And because of that, when the time came, the Jewish people left Mitzrayim. The Jewish people left Mitzrayim. So if that's the case, now if you look in the English, the translation by Rabbi Herzog, he did a masterful job, not that he needs me to confirm that, but if you have a chance to look at it, or the Beis Halevi is worth learning. It's a beautiful sefer, and his translation, if you need any help, is fantastic. But I just want to make sure, do you understand what the Beis Halevi was saying? He's saying not that if the Torah tells us, oh, this is the reason for these mitzvot, it's because we left Mitzrayim, so we keep these mitzvot. It reminds us of Mitzrayim. That's nice. That's nice, and it's an opportunity for us to feel gratitude and to relate to the past history and all that kind of stuff. But the fact of the existence of the mitzvot is independent. And those mitzvot existed before creation, before Mitzrayim, before the first Jews set foot in Mitzrayim. Those mitzvot already existed. We have no reason for why they exist. They just do. Any more than any of us would presume to explain why. Well, why is there a law of gravity? There's a law of gravity. There's a phenomenon of gravity. Stand on your head and you can't change it. It's fine, I didn't mean it that way, right? You can't change the law of gravity. You can't change the laws of electromagnetic induction. You can't change those laws. There are laws of physics. You can't change them. They were created at the beginning of all of existence, and there they are. Same thing with the mitzvot. So to talk about the reasons, they have no reasons in the real sense. In the supernal heights, there are no reasons, at least none that we can talk about in any meaningful human kind of way. If all of that is true, and it is, so then we can talk about the Avot and the Imahot observing Pesach long before anybody ever arrived in Mitzrayim, long before, which is why the Chumash tells us that the three Malachim arrived. And when they arrived, Avraham and Sarah, what were they doing? They were eating matzah, because that's the appropriate, the logical thing to do on Pesach. They were perceptive enough, they were spiritually sensitive enough to know that to eat, now listen very carefully, very, very carefully, to eat chametz on the 15th day of Nisan is absurd. It's ridiculous. It would be to do that, to eat chametz on the 15th day of Nisan, God forbid, would be to act in a way which is contrary to the laws of nature, the laws of Teva, of the spiritual realm, the laws, capital L. In the same way, look, I'll give you a mashal. One would never think of walking off the top of a 50-story building in Manhattan. We wouldn't say that's absurd. It's absurd. You're about to run head to head into the laws of the material world, the law of gravity, and it's going to clobber you. It's going to clobber you. Your body is going to emerge. It won't emerge unscathed. It's going to be destroyed, God forbid. In the same way, the nimshal is to consume chametz on the 15th day of the month of Nisan would be absurd. It would be to act in a way which would do damage, violent damage to the neshama, to a person's neshama, because they've just run head to head into a law, capital L, of the spiritual realm. Now, we don't sense any of those things, do we? I don't. I'm not perceptive to any of the phenomena in the spiritual realm. Anybody here, now for those of you who are watching the recording, you can't see this, but I count about 1,732 participants. I'm going to describe to you what's going on. All the boxes are on. I can see everybody because people want me to see their shining faces, participatory and excited. So let me show of hands. How many of you are perceptive to phenomena in the spiritual realm? Just show your hand, or do that icon. You can put your hand up on the side of your box. All right. I don't see a lot of them, and that's okay, because it's all right. We can be honest. We can be honest enough to admit that we're not at that level. But if we're not sensitive to be able to perceive those emanations, those phenomena in the spiritual realm, it doesn't mean that they don't exist. Oh, they exist. It just means that we can't perceive them. It means that we're not on the level of the Avot and the Imahot, but they were. They were. They could sense. They could stand on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, and they could stretch out their arms, and they could bathe. They could bathe in the cosmic energy of liberation that was being released into the universe. Now, let's talk a little bit about this, because this is very important, and this is another foundational idea that is, it's necessary, it's essential for the success in this type of learning or in any kind of learning, and that is humility. We have to be very careful not to cut down the giants of Tanakh, or the giants of the Tanoim, or the Amoraim, or the Gaonim, or the Rishonim, or the Achronim. But each one of those represents a gigantic step down. But we have to be very careful, God forbid, never to cut these people down to the level, to our own smallness. Just because we're operating on a very small scale, if we went back one generation ago, there was Rav Avigdor Miller. 2 generations ago, there was the Chafetz Chaim. If we went back a couple of hundred years, there was the Gra. We can't relate to any of these people. We're not on their level. We wouldn't presume, how dare we even imagine in our wildest nightmares that we would pass judgment on them. or that we would judge them by the standards by which we live our own lives, we understand ourselves to be. So let's just talk about this. And I'll give you an example or two. And I don't think that what I'm saying goes against the grain. I don't think that this is something which is, when you hear this, you're going to go, no, I don't believe it. But I will tell you, I have encountered audiences, even in the frum world, people nebuch who have never been educated properly, and they've never been taught these ideas. So they look at the people, we're going to be looking at the lives and the behaviors, the actions of the avot and imahot, the giants of Tanakh, the members, the generation of the Jews who left Mitzrayim, the Dor Deah. That's what we call them, the Dor Deah, the generation. They were filled with knowledge. They were connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu like nothing. And I've heard people, Hashem should forgive me for saying this, when they'll say a bunch of complainers in the desert, we would never behave like that. We would never. We would have been so grateful. Absurd. I don't think I'm telling you a chiddush, but I will tell you it's a chiddush for a lot of people out there in the world. So let's just look at a source or two that will give us an idea. It'll concretize, it'll confirm these ideas a little more. Right, we're going to talk about being sensitive to the radiation, right? Emanations in the spiritual realm. So let's look for an example at a different kind of radiation that came later in history, later in world history, and it was perhaps of human origin. It wasn't keyed into the fabric of reality at the beginning of creation, but it's possible that humans can behave in a way that calls forth a response from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that gets keyed into the structure of reality. Then when that happens, what it does is it inspires the creation of a rabbinic holiday. So the Ramchal tells us this. You should have it in your packet. It's an English. It's translated into English. It's just a paragraph. And what the Ramchal says is this. He's not distinguishing between those that at the dawn of creation or those later. He's talking about the fact that the nature of time, the Jewish understanding of the nature of time is that time is cyclical. And as we move through the calendar, we come back, and every time we come to the 15th of the month of Nisan, a cosmic energy is re-released. It's an energy of liberation. When we come back, we cycle through time, we come back to the first day of the month of Tishrei. So there is an energy which is released because of the fact of the first release of energy, which saw the creation of the first human being. They're breaking into two, they're being judged, all of those things. And we cycle through the year, we come back, and when we arrive back at the first of Tishrei, that same cosmic radiation is released. So too with all of the Jewish holidays, the regalim with all of them. So the Ramchal says that when we come back to that time, we cycle through the year, we come back to that date, the 15th day of the month of Tishrei, or the 6th of Sivan, or the 7th of Sivan, or whatever date it is, that same release of energy occurs. And to those people who are giants and who have trained themselves and have elevated themselves to reach a level of sensitivity where they exist, they're sensitive, they're responsive to events, to phenomena on the spiritual plane, they stand back and they're bathed in cosmic radiation. It's extraordinary. That's the Jewish people. That's what the Jewish people can produce. It's unbelievable. So the Ramchal uses this idea to explain that the Hashmonaim, they fought the Greeks. They didn't intend to win. They intended to die al Kiddush Hashem. If you look in the Leket Sichos Musar from Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher, he has a magnificent essay on this topic. They went out to die. It was impossible. It was unthinkable that they could win. They went out to die al Kiddush Hashem, to be Mekadosh Shem Shamayim, to make it clear that not all the Jews in Eretz Yisrael had compromised in any way. They hadn't compromised in any way. And lo and behold, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they won. They won at great personal cost, but they won. They beat a superpower, this ragtag group of Talmidei Chachamim, pigeon-chested, pale Talmidei Chachamim, who had never left the Beis Medrash. They defeated the greatest warriors of that time, of that civilization. So, okay, there are lots of examples of miracles that the Jewish people have experienced. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has bailed the Jewish people out many times. And they had a Sefer Megillah, it was Megillah Tanis, right? It was a Sefer in which the Chachamim recorded miraculous salvations. Now, HaKadosh Baruch Hu he presided over these salvations for the Jewish people. And there were many of them. And we don't really observe those every year. They've been lost to history. There's a reason, but they don't continue. So the Chachamim of that time, they thought, well, this is another one of those examples. And it was dramatic, spectacular. We see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in our midst and he hasn't abandoned us. So the Gemara tells us something interesting. It says that the Jewish people prevailed and they still had another 25 years of fighting to do. This was about 6 years into the battle. They regained control of the Beis HaMikdash and they purified and they rededicated it and they resumed the sacrificial service. Like I said, they would have to continue fighting another 25 years, and that 25 years would see most of the Hashmonayim dead. But they had won. They had regained control of the Beis HaMikdash and resumed the Korbanos. So the Gemara tells us, L'shana Acheret, the next year, the Chachamim Kivuam, they enacted the holiday of Hanukkah. So the question everybody asks is, why L'shana Acheret, the next year? Next year, they created a holiday. Were they too busy that first year? They had other things they're pressing. They just couldn't get to it now. When my calendar clears up, when I have winter vacation, they didn't say at that point when I have Xmas vacation because, it would have been meaningless at that point. But why did they wait? L'shana Acheret, the next year. So the Ramchal tells us that what happened was they just chalked it up like this was a momentary salvation from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that was it. But the next year, when the next year arrived, and they sensed the release of the same kind of cosmic radiation that they had experienced the year before, they said, oh, wow. They realized that as in response to the actions of the Jewish people, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had released energy and he had programmed it into the structure of reality, that energy would be released on that date forevermore. On the 25th day of the month of Kislev, that energy was released. So the next year, the energy, when they felt the energy released, they said, oh, this wasn't a temporary miracle. This was one that we must memorialize. We're going to create the holiday of Hanukkah so that we can re-experience it every year. Now, had we been there, and I don't want to belabor the point, had we been there, we would have said, oh, it's the winter. I feel nothing. We're going to go to Florida. We like to go to the Fontainebleau. We always go there every year. Oh, we love it. We're going to Disneyland. You can get a minion there. You can get kosher food. That's what we would have said. But because we're not sensitive. But the Chachamim in that era, they were very sensitive. When they sensed the release of that exact same cosmic energy, they knew that this was a chag for the ages. So they legislated the Rabbanan holiday, the rabbinic holiday of Hanukkah. Now, there's something closer to our own times. The Regina Rebbe, when he was a child, I've seen this story, the Hasidim like to tell this story. It's a beautiful story. The Gemara describes a machlokas about the situation is a person is lost in the desert, God forbid, and they've lost track of time. They don't know what day it is. So the question is, when do they observe Shabbos? They certainly have to keep Shabbos. When do they do it? So one view says they count 6 days from now, and then they keep a day as Shabbos. The other view is they keep Shabbos right away, and then they resume counting 6 days, have a Shabbos. Even if it's a simulation, the person has to have Shabbos, and they're connected with Shabbos in this way. So the Regina Rebbe, when he was a child, his Rebbe in Cheder, the Melamed, was teaching him this Gemara. So the Rebbe asked in all innocence, I don't understand the Gemara. Rebbe, I don't understand the Gemara. Why not just look up into the sky? and see. You can see the sky of Shabbos is so different. It's filled with Kedusha. The Rebbe thought that he was being a wise guy and punished him. And the Regina Rebbe, the boy who would grow up to become the Regina Rebbe, went home and he was upset. And his father came in and said to the Melamed, you have to understand, he's a little boy, but he has refined himself. He's elevated himself to such a level that he's sensitive to emanations, to phenomena in the spiritual realm. He can look up in the sky and he can tell when it's Shabbos. What a beautiful idea. So such phenomena exist, in other words, and that's closer to a couple hundred years ago. People could reach that level. Al achas kama v'chama, to go back 3,500 years to the fathers and mothers of the Jewish people, they were sensitive. And the Gemara in Yuma 28a tells us that the Avos and the Imahos, they kept all of the mitzvot of the Torah because for them, they were perceptive and they could sense them in the same way that we can sense phenomena in the physical realm. Now, when the Gemara tells us this idea that they kept the mitzvot, let's consider now, how did they practically implement those? How did they practically implement this, right? This concept of mitzvah observance. Before I continue, I just want to make sure that I'm clear. If anybody has any kind of a question, you can put it in the chat. I will from time to time try to look at it, or the course administrator. Every course on Livnos has an administrator always present, like a sky marshal on a plane. So if nothing gets out of hand, nobody turns violent. So if you would like to ask a question, you need clarification, please feel free to speak up. Now, when we talk about how does one practically implement this concept of they kept the mitzvot before they were given. So sometimes the mitzvah itself was clothed in different outer technical details. So if you look on the packet, the sheet that I gave you, you'll see I brought you an excerpt from a book called the Tiferes Avos. It's by Rabbi Doron Gold. Rabbi Doron Gold, he's a Mashiach, a big Talmud Chacham in Eretz Yisrael. And the Sefer itself, the Tiferes Avos, is Hagisha HaNechona. It's the proper approach, L'limud HaParshiot Shel Maaseh Avot. It's the right approach. It's knowing how to learn the stories of the Avos and the Imahos, how to learn them properly to relate. In other words, the ideas that I'm sharing with you, these ideas of not cutting them down to the smallness of our own beings. So Rabbi Gold discusses it at length in this book. It's worth getting a copy if your Hebrew is good enough and you're up to the challenge. He brings, it's mostly excerpts from classic Sfarim throughout all the generations, all the way up to the present time, excerpts from the Chazon Ish, Rav Aaron Kotler. This book is, it's a diamond. It is a diamond. So in the excerpt that I gave you, the one issue is, if you look at that font, I've never seen a font like that in a Sefer. It is so disorienting. So, okay, fine. But he's talking about the fact that in Parshat Vayetze, there is a pasuk. The pasuk says, let me read it to you. If you have it, you can look. I think it is chapter 30. And it's verse 37 and 38, or 37 through 39. It says, Vayikach lo Yaakov makal livne lach veluz v'armon vayifatzel bahen b'tzolot levanot machsov halavan asher al hamaklot vayatzeg et hamaklot asher pitzel barahitim. Barahatim, right, etc., etc., because it can take me a long time to read it. It's 3 psukim. If you look in the English, it talks about the fact that Yaakov then took himself, these glasses, it's hard for me to read anything, fresh rods of poplar and hazel and chestnut. He peeled white streaks in them, laying bare the white of the rods. He set up the rods which he had peeled in the run, etc., etc. You have a chance. It's chapter 30, Lamed, and its sentences, verses 37 through 39. he set these rods up that he had processed accordingly. He set them up opposite where the flocks would come to drink. And when they came to drink, they would face these rods, and it would in some way or other stimulate them. And then as a result, they gave birth. Their offspring had certain outer appearances. They were speckled or ringed or things like that. Later on, a loved one would complain about this, and he would say that, you tried to cheat me, etc. And there's a discussion about the interaction, the commercial relation, the economic relationship, the business relationship that they had created. It's a strange story. There's lots to be said about it. If you look in the Leket Sichos Musar from Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Sher, or in the Ora Tzafun from the Alter, they have a lot of nice things to say about that particular episode. The Zohar has something to say about it as well. The Zohar says, and I brought you the excerpt all to show you that there's one line. It's dotted. It's underlined in a dotted kind of broken line. The Zohar says, Shahamaklot hayu besod hatfilin. That when Yaakov Avinu, when he was dealing with these sticks and processing them, what he accomplished in the spiritual realm, he accomplished the same thing spiritually that a man would accomplish by putting on tefillin. What a man accomplishes in the spiritual realm, what the mitzvah of tefillin allows, it creates and enables a certain flow of cosmic energy, spiritual infusion to a human being, to a Jew who observes the mitzvah. So what that infusion is, that spiritual accomplishment, what it is. So Yaakov Avinu accomplished the same spiritual accomplishment when he was processing those rods the way he did. Now, what that means, as if I know what that means. How on earth could I know what that means? The concept is so unfathomably deep. So I, in my arrogance, I'm going to presume to explain it to you. My gut tells me, my intuition tells me I can understand it on a very simple level, probably the same way you. I have nothing more to add than you do, which is that there is some inner spiritual concept. There was an underlying principle that existed. It's been clothed after Matan Torah. It's clothed in a particular outer action of boxes with leather straps, and there are parchments written inside, and a man puts them on arms, on the arm opposite the heart, and on the forehead, next to the intellect, between the eyes. I mean, all of those, whatever that accomplishes, Yaakov Avinu, he wasn't dealing on some mundane plane, and he was just looking at a bunch of rods, and he was trying to protect himself financially from a bad guy who was trying to cheat him. It was much deeper than that. And what this tells us, it enables the concept, the possibility that the avot and the imahot can behave. We can read stories depicting them behaving in certain ways. And if Chazal tell us that, in fact, they were observing a certain mitzvah, they were accomplishing the same accomplishment that the mitzvah as we know it in the particular form that it takes today, what it accomplishes, what it allows us to accomplish, so they could do it with different props. The mitzvot had different outer technical, physical forms, didn't matter. They, on their level, were able to accomplish the same spiritual accomplishment, albeit with different outer props. Okay, that is a possibility. And there are several examples of that. So, for example, let me give you another example. If you look, I believe I gave you on the handout an explanation by the Chanukas HaTorah, the Rebbe of Heschel. He was not a Hasidic Rebbe. He existed before Hasidus. He was known as the Rebbe of Heschel because he was universally beloved. He was both Rav, Rosh Hashiva, he was the Gadol Hador, and he was the Rebbe. He was the loving teacher of the Am Yisrael in the mid-1600s. He was the teacher of the Shach and the Taz. He was the undisputed Gadol Hador at the time. We know him for his greatness in learning halacha, but he also left over some insights in the realm of hashkafic kinds of things, explanations of Agarata, etc. Those ideas, none of his actual works are extant. Someone collected them together, some of his Divrei Torah on Chumash, on Tanakh, and they created a book. It's a simulation of a sefer from him called the Chanukas HaTorah. I had the tremendous zechus to translate it into English about 20 years ago. What you have in your packet is the Hebrew original. It's not his exact wording. It's paraphrased from his students, but then I believe you have the English translation that is mine. So what happens is this. I'll let you refer to it. Let's see if I can find it. Rivka Imenu tells her son, Yaakov Avinu, she tells him that he should dress up and he should pretend to be Esav. She'll prepare food and he'll go in. Esav, we are told that Yitzchak Avinu is preparing to give him the Gashmius bracha. The Ruchnius bracha, there was never any question about that. That was going to go to Yaakov Avinu. But the Gashmius bracha, he intended to give to Esav. Now, we have the sense that Yitzchak Avinu had an inaccurate picture. He had an inaccurate notion of who Esav was. So we think of Esav as a big, tough, bad guy. He was a biker and he dressed like a hoodlum and he was a dangerous fellow. None of that is true. None of that is true. In point of fact, he looked exactly the same as his brother. The two of them looked indistinguishable. They were indistinguishable in their midos and every action that they performed. The only reason that we know, the only reason that Rivka Imenu knew that he wasn't to get the bracha was because of the fact that she'd been given a nevuah. She'd been given a nevuah when she went to Shem and Aver, to the yeshiva there, and they told her, oh, that other one, he's not worthy to be the continuer. She didn't share that information with her husband for whatever reason. Those are questions to be asked. But she lived her life knowing she couldn't see nothing on the outside. He conducted himself like a Rosh Hashiva. Like any Rosh Hashiva could ever live up to that. He behaved and he looked indistinguishable from he looked like a son of the family of the Avos and the Imahos. In fact, we can see this, and this is not our topic, but that's why you should take the course on the Slabotka approach to learning Tanakh, because at one point, he spoke in an indelicate way. He said to his brother, when he came home from the Levaya, he came home from Avraham, and he said to him, he said, give me that red food. And Yaakov Avinu was shocked by the indelicacy of his language. What kind of coarse language is that? Some time ago, it was a couple of years ago, we were at a Shabbos table. I said to one of my children, I said, can you hand me that green food, whatever that green, and they said, just like Esav. Just like Esav. I was a little horrified. So out of character was it for him to speak in a way which is inappropriate on their level. Can you imagine saying, can you hand me that red food? What on earth? Why would that earn the Torah's condemnation? On our level, it doesn't. On theirs, it did. So much so the Torah says, Al Cain, and therefore, forevermore he's called Edom. The one time in his life, a little breach of etiquette, whatever that etiquette, whatever the breach was, I can't tell you. The Torah for the rest of time, he and his descendants, they're called Edom. They're called Edom. What that means is he wasn't in the habit of breaching etiquette, their etiquette. Anyway, all of this, though, is for another time, and it's beyond this. So you see how badly I want to teach a course on the Slabotka approach to Tanakh. Every semester, I send in my resume, I write up a course proposal, and I get passed over by senior tenured lecturers at Livnos who are much more experienced. I recognize that they are much more qualified. Anyway, back to our story. So Rivka Imenu knows through the Nevuah that Esav should not receive the bracha. He shouldn't receive the bracha of Gashmis. It's got to go to Yaakov Avinu as well. So she tells her son, get dressed up, I'll give you the food, go in, and using subterfuge, take the bracha. Yaakov says, I don't want to take the bracha. I don't want to take the bracha. I don't want to do this. I don't want to behave in this way. And what happens, what the story describes us, what the event was, that Rivka Imenu and her son Yaakov Avinu are arguing about the parameters of behaving in a way that is not absolutely, literally honest, not literally truthful in the most straightforward, simple definition of that term, of honesty or of truth. The Chanukas Torah, when he's talking about this, and he asks this question, what Yaakov says is, oh my goodness, I don't want to do this, because he says, "V'heveti alai klola v'lo bracha." I will bring upon myself a curse, not a blessing, not a bracha. I'm going to bring upon myself a klola, a curse, if I behave in this way. So the Chanukas Torah asks this question. He says, "V'yesh ladaktek tinach delo yavi alav et habracha." Okay, I understand. If Yitzchak Avinu discovers who it is, he won't give him the bracha. Aval klola manda karshmei. Who on earth could imagine what father would curse his son, let alone how much more so Yitzchak Avinu? He would curse his son? Halo rachmanu ta'av al haben, right? Think about the rachmanis that a father, a parent has on a child. Ubeprat Yitzchak Avinu, aflo yirtza levarcha, even though he doesn't want to give him a bracha, perhaps, aval lo mikalel oto chas v'shalom, certainly won't curse him. So the Chanukas Torah expresses it. We might think that, oh, this is so cute. This is such a whimsical formulation. He says, "V'yesh lomar de Yaakov v'Rivka hayu mechulokim b'zeh ha'inyan v'hinei b'parshat ki tavo ktiv arur mashka arur," etc. What he says is this. He says, they were arguing about pshat in a pasuk. There's a pasuk in Devarim, chapter 27:18. We've seen before, the font is too small for me to read it. But what the pasuk there says is, "Orur, cursed is the one who causes a blind person to go astray." So they were arguing about that. In this matter, Yitzchak Avinu was blind. He didn't have clarity. He didn't know how to go on the path. So they were arguing about, the way the Chanukas Torah describes it is, they were mechulakim, they were arguing about pshat in the pasuk. So what they were doing was this, they were arguing, now, let me ask you this, were they literally arguing about pshat in the pasuk? The Torah hadn't been given to the Jewish people yet. Did they know the psukim? Or were they discussing the hashkafic meaning of truth? The definition, the hashkafic and halachic meaning of the term truth, of the concept of truth. Were they identifying deeper meanings of the term? Were they debating the morality of the various courses of behavior and alternatives before them? Were they arguing about those in the larger philosophical sense, or were they arguing about pshat in the pasuk? In other words, in which case, when the Chanukas Torah, when he formulates it as they were arguing about pshat in the pasuk, he doesn't mean it literally, perhaps. What he's saying, he's using a kind of shorthand, a kind of placeholder, a symbolism. Because the concepts of the Torah existed before the Torah was given to the Jewish people. They existed in the spiritual realm. And the Avos and the Imahos were sensitive to these ideas. And they were arguing about these hashkafic concepts of lying. Yaakov Avinu said, I'm taking a much more literal approach. You don't present yourself in a way which is not absolutely literally true in every possible way. Rivka Imenu was talking about a deeper truth, and she was saying this would be for the good. The pasuk there, the concept of a person who lies to a blind person, they should be cursed. The universe, the fabric of reality demands, logic dictates that a person who lies to a blind person should be cursed. But the pasuk says, if they mislead them, they cause them to go astray on the road. And she said this, she said, intent is everything. If you lie with the intention of putting the person back on the road, then that's not halachically, hashkafically problematic. That's not immoral. They weren't just arguing in air, they were sensitized to the spiritual realm. They were connected to God's truth. The Chanukas of Torah, he can say, they were arguing about pshat in a pasuk. Now, and he could mean that's just symbolic. I don't want to call it a whimsical description, but you understand the concept. It's a symbolic portrayal. Now, honestly, if you tell me that they knew prophetically that such a pasuk would exist, because as I said, that pasuk already did exist by this point in history. Even though the Torah hadn't been given yet to the Jewish people, it predated creation. So the pasuk existed. So if you tell me that they knew prophetically that the pasuk existed, I won't be surprised and I won't be troubled. And in that case, I would be very proud if someone calls me naive. Oh, he's so naive to believe these childish, these fairy tales, these rabbinic fairy tales. That's what I see sometimes. People will post, God forbid. HaKadosh should have mercy on the people who wrote that. I've seen it on the internet. People write on various groups, and they'll post places and they'll say, "Oh, rabbinic fairy tales. They were arguing about pshat and a pasuk." It's okay. I'm happy to be naive that way. Livnos College, by the way, has a policy. It is unapologetically, it is very proudly extreme in its hashkafas. So if you were to tell me that they actually knew prophetically such a pasuk would exist and they were darshaning out the words in the pasuk, I have no problem. But it could also mean that they had identified these concepts of truth, intentionality, acting on behalf of someone else, that these ideas were embedded in the very fabric of creation. So if we encounter a chazal, and I recognize that we're a few minutes away from ending, we'll end on time. If we encounter a chazal or an explanation of some later commentator that portrays people in Tanakh, in quotes, arguing over pshat in a pasuk, don't be so immature or childish or unsophisticated to dismiss it as, oh, a charming folk tale, or don't, right? Or talk about the chachamim, their naivete or the whimsical nature. Don't do that. Instead, what you should do is attribute. Right? If you have those kind of feelings, you have the instinct to dismiss what they're saying. So attribute it to your own childishness or your own lack of sophistication in understanding Chazal or those later commentators. What I would tell you is, there is an excellent book called Learning to Read Medrash, and the author of the book, Simi Peters, she discusses this language that Chazal use. She claims that, varying degrees along a continuum of literalness. But I think it's important to remember, if we see, and we're going to see this very often in the course, we'll talk about people in the Tanakh, they're arguing about pshat and a pasuk, or they're arguing about a certain psak. It doesn't need to mean that they were opening up a stone chumash. I don't think that the avos imos could go down to their local Sfarim store and buy an art scroll Gemara. It doesn't mean that. But they had access to the concepts, which, and that's what I spent the whole time today explaining to you. Those concepts are timeless, and they weren't suddenly introduced to the Jewish people. We didn't first become aware of them the day of Matan Torah. The Jewish people from the time of the Avos and the Imos knew about them from the very beginning. That's a very important setup, the premise for this course. And I would just tell you this, just by way of concluding, we had just explored the possibility that mitzvah observance could be with a different outer form. Perhaps the prop is different, or we're not actually using the psukim, but ideas similar. But we could also say that perhaps they kept the mitzvot with the same technical details and the outer mechanics. We'll encounter that very often. They could, where it was feasible, they kept the mitzvot the same way the Torah legislates it and dictates it to us later in history. So what that means is this, and I have 2 minutes, and I'm mindful, I understand. The halachic process, keep this in mind. This is our setup for the rest of the course. The halachic process works the same way as mitzvah legislation. In other words, it's not just that Hashem gave us mitzvot and then the halachic process of explication, all the rest of history is made up. No, it also has its origin in that timeless source before creation. What that means is the halachic process, what we do when we engage in the halachic process, is the halacha teases out the details of fulfilling the mitzvah. As such, the ongoing process of halachic discussion throughout the ages, the ongoing process of halachic of elaboration and explication is the ongoing process of further identifying and clarifying the very features of creation. It's teasing out the details, the fine points of the fabric of reality. Halachic discussion is the process of revealing ever more the finer and finer aspects of creation. So that means the halachic process is not, poskim do not create, they don't legislate. Poskim throughout the ages, starting from the Gemara before, from the Mishnah before, all the way through to modern day poskim, they engage in a process of identification and clarification of the features of reality as reflected in the details of halachic observance. So the halachicist in the spiritual realm of existence is exactly what the scientist is in the material realm of existence. Neither is making stuff up. They're merely listening carefully to reality, speak to them, and they're reporting their findings. And by way of conclusion, I would just tell you, when I talk about that parallel between the halachicist and the scientist, the halachicist in the spiritual realm and the scientist in the physical realm, I'm talking about real scientists who practiced real science. We don't, of course, refer to the shakranim. We see them increasingly in the news nowadays, the politicians and the propagandists who engage in the practice not of science, but of scientism. And they routinely make up manipulative lies out of whole cloth. That's not science. And I refer you to my course several semesters ago, recorded Torah and Science, for an elaboration, the distinction between science and scientism. The halachicist in the spiritual realm is exactly the same as the scientist, an objective scientist working with integrity, honestly. In the physical realm, no one would accuse Sir Isaac Newton of making things up. He was listening to reality speak to him. Lahavdil, the halachicist, the Talmid Chacham, who was engaged in the halachic process, is doing exactly that, listening very carefully to objective reality, speak to him, and he's reporting his findings. We will continue this course. I hope you enjoyed this introduction. We have lots to cover, a lot of miles to go in this course, and I look forward to learning with you this summer semester. All the best. Bye-bye.